It started like any other quiet morning on my ranch. The sun had barely come up, and the only thing you could hear was the breeze moving through the trees. I was sitting on my porch, sipping coffee, watching the fog roll across the fields. Peaceful. Simple. Normal. Then I heard it, a loud, sudden buzz in the sky. Not a bird, not a drone. Louder, lower, and getting closer fast. Within seconds, a small private plane came into view, shaky, off course, wobbling like it was barely hanging on. I stood up, trying to track it with my eyes. My heart started racing. It dipped, jolted, and then slammed into the far side of my ranch, just past the creek. The impact shook the ground. Smoke started rising. I dropped my mug and ran. By the time I reached the crash site, the wreckage was already smoldering. I called 911 and gave exact coordinates. I didn't care about fences or rules. This was a matter of life and death. Emergency crews needed to get here fast. I had no idea who was on board, but I knew time mattered. Fire trucks, police units, and first responders showed up within minutes. And right behind them, Karen. Not just any Karen. I'm talking about our HOA president. Clipboard. Sunglasses. Arms crossed like she was guarding the gates of heaven. And even though this wasn't even technically her jurisdiction, she came charging down the hill like she owned the entire mountain range. She blocked the trail with her golf cart and started yelling at the EMTs. I don't see any permits for this. This is private community land. You can't just bring heavy vehicles through here. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. A plane had just crashed. Smoke was still in the air. And she was worried about vehicle permits? I walked straight toward her, calmly but firmly. This is my property, I said. Step aside. You're in the way of an active investigation. But she didn't move. Instead, she turned to the emergency crews and said, "Do you have permission from the HOA to enter this trail? Because I didn't approve it." That's when one of the firefighters, clearly confused, looked at me. "Sir, can you confirm you're the landowner?" I nodded. Yes. The crash happened on my ranch. It's my land, and I've already spoken to dispatch. You're cleared to be here. Karen wasn't satisfied. "Do you have that in writing?" she snapped. One of the paramedics gave her a look like, "Are you serious right now?" They were trying to get down the embankment with their gear, and here she was playing parking enforcement. Then she did something that left even the police speechless. She called in another 911 report. On her phone. Right there in front of everyone. She told them there are unauthorized individuals entering HOA-controlled access roads without board approval. I stood in silence for a second. I couldn't believe she was actually doing this. Interfering with rescue and investigation teams during an emergency. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I wasn't just a ranch owner. I'm a senior federal official. And in that moment, she had just crossed a line she didn't even know existed. The officers who responded to her second call came fast. But the second they arrived and saw the fire crews, the crash site, and me standing there calmly with ID in hand, their tone changed fast. I handed over my credentials and said, "There's been a misunderstanding. This crash site falls under immediate federal jurisdiction. You're welcome to confirm it with your department." One of the deputies made a quick call. Less than a minute later, he nodded respectfully, turned to Karen and said, "Ma'am, step aside." Now. She tried to argue, but he shut her down. "This is a federal matter. You're not just interfering with private property, you're interfering with an investigation. Do not make this worse." She stood there frozen, then backed off without another word. But I knew her silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy. Because when someone like her gets embarrassed, they don't quit, they get creative. The crash site was still active, and the smell of smoke lingered in the air like a warning that something bigger was coming. Investigators from the FAA had just arrived, setting up tape, snapping photos, and gathering what little evidence hadn't been scorched. I kept a respectful distance but stayed nearby, answering questions when they asked. After all, this was still my land. I had every right to be there. But Karen didn't get the message. About an hour after being told to back off, she came creeping back up the hill. This time, she wasn't yelling. She wasn't driving her golf cart like a parade float. She was quiet, too quiet, and she wasn't alone. 2 more HOA board members followed behind her, both of them carrying clipboards and muttering to each other like they were preparing to file some kind of lawsuit. One of them pulled out his phone and started filming. Not the crash, not the investigators. I walked over calmly and said, "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Karen straightened her sunglasses and gave me the fakest smile I've ever seen. "We're simply documenting the damage. The HOA has a right to protect its interest in community areas." I raised an eyebrow. "You mean the land I personally own? The land your HOA has no authority over?" One of the other board members chimed in. "According to our map, this trail leads through common grounds. It's under shared responsibility." I nearly laughed. Their map? The one from the HOA welcome packet? Not the legal county records. Not the certified land survey. Just a printed brochure that hadn't been updated in 15 years. "You're welcome to take that up with my lawyer," I said. "But unless you're with the FAA or local law enforcement, I suggest you leave." Karen smirked. "We'll see about that." That phrase stuck with me. Later that afternoon, after the crash team had packed up and left, I returned to the ranch house to finally get some rest. But waiting in my inbox was a message from the HOA board. It wasn't friendly. The subject line read, "Urgent violation, unauthorized emergency activity." I opened it and nearly choked on my coffee. They were accusing me of violating community policy by allowing unauthorized vehicles, unapproved visitors, and disruptive events on HOA land. The email even had a fine attached, $30004, damages to common property and violation of access protocols. They were really doing it. They were really trying to fine me for a plane crash I didn't cause, on land they didn't own, during an investigation they tried to block. I didn't even reply. Instead, I picked up the phone and called my lawyer. He answered with a sigh. "Let me guess. They sent a letter?" "An invoice, actually," I said. $3,000 and a claim that I caused damage to their property." He laughed. "Typical HOA nonsense. Don't pay it. Don't even acknowledge it. I'll handle it." And that was that, for about 12 hours. The next morning, I found a brand new sign posted right at the edge of my property. Bright red, nailed into the tree line, bold capital letters. "Warning, no entry, community land, trespassers will be fined." It wasn't just ugly. It was threatening. And it was planted right next to the trail where the investigators had set up. It was meant for me. So I did what I had every legal right to do. I pulled the sign down and tossed it into my truck bed. 2 hours later, another email landed in my inbox. Tampering with HOA property. You are now under review. This wasn't about a plane crash anymore. This was personal. Karen didn't care about safety. She didn't care about boundaries. She cared about power, and the fact that someone like me, someone she couldn't control, was now her neighbor. And the more she pushed, the more obvious it became. She had no idea who she was dealing with. I knew Karen wasn't going to back down quietly, but even I was surprised at how fast she shifted from annoying to full-on hostile. It was like the crash gave her a new excuse to flex her HOA muscles, and now she was doubling down. But what she didn't realize, what none of the board realized, was that every message, every threat, every fake violation they sent me was now evidence. And I was collecting all of it. That afternoon, I decided to pay a little visit to the county records office. I walked in, requested a certified property map, and had them highlight the exact boundaries of my land. I even got a printed copy of the official parcel number and ownership record. And guess what? That so-called common trail they kept talking about? It was completely inside my property line, by over 300 feet. Not even close to the HOA's claimed border. Armed with the documents, I drove straight to the HOA office. Not to argue. Just to deliver. Karen wasn't there, but her assistant was. I handed her the envelope and said, "Please give this to your board. It's proof that the land you're threatening me over isn't yours. I expect this harassment to stop immediately." She didn't say a word. Just nodded and took the papers like they were radioactive. I left calmly, but not before snapping a photo of the big HOA mission statement framed on the wall. It read, asterisk, promoting harmony and respect throughout our community. Asterisk, the irony nearly made me laugh out loud. The next few days were quiet, at least on the surface. No emails. No new signs. No board members filming me from the bushes. But something felt off. It was too calm. Then I got a phone call, not from the HOA, but from one of the FAA agents who'd been on site during the crash. He asked if I was available to meet again. I said yes, of course. They were still piecing together what went wrong with the plane, and apparently, they needed to confirm access points on my land for their report. I offered to walk them through the area again. No problem. But right before we wrapped up the call, the agent asked something that stopped me cold. Did your HOA really try to block our investigation? I told him yes, and that they even called 911 to try and stop the initial response. There was a long pause. Then he said, we've had interference before, but never from a neighborhood association. That stuck with me. It wasn't just ridiculous, it might actually be a crime. Interfering with a federal investigation? Calling in false reports? Posting threatening signage to scare off officials? That went way beyond annoying. That was something I could take legal action over. So I called my attorney again. This time, I didn't just want to respond. I wanted to go on offense. He told me to start documenting everything publicly. Not to fight them behind closed doors, but to let the truth come out where everyone could see it. So I made copies of all the fake violations, all the photos of the signs, the footage of their board members trying to block access. I even printed out the satellite imagery with county-stamped property lines showing my ownership of the entire crash site. Then I did one better. I invited the local newspaper to do a story, not on me, but on how an HOA had tried to interfere with a federal crash investigation. They were all over it. Reporter came out the next day, took photos, asked me questions, even interviewed some neighbors who had witnessed Karen's behavior. And just like that, the board's little game wasn't just neighborhood gossip anymore. It was news. By the end of that week, the story was online. Headline: Plane crash on private ranch sparks HOA interference allegations. It didn't name Karen directly, but everyone in the neighborhood knew exactly who it was about. And just like that, the emails started again, but this time, from residents. Some thanked me. Some shared their own stories about the HOA threatening them over ridiculous things. Wind chimes, mailbox colors, backyard gardens. Apparently, this wasn't new. I was just the first one who pushed back and didn't fold. It was becoming clearer by the hour, this wasn't just about me anymore. A few days after the newspaper article dropped, something strange happened. I was out by the far pasture checking fences when I noticed an SUV parked just outside my gate. Not marked. Not one of the usual board members either. I watched from a distance for a minute. The driver didn't get out. Just sat there, windows up, engine running. It wasn't until I walked back toward the main house that I saw it again. Same SUV, this time slowly rolling down the gravel path along the edge of the woods, still outside my property line, but watching. I knew right away this wasn't random. Someone had sent them. Or maybe they were just there to observe and report, like I was suddenly a suspect instead of the person whose land a plane had crashed into. I didn't confront them. I didn't need to. Let them watch. Everything I was doing was by the book. That same evening, I received another official-looking envelope. This time hand-delivered. HOA letterhead again. Inside was a brand new notice of violation. Not about the plane crash. Not about unauthorized emergency activity. No, this one was about unauthorized outbuildings on the north edge of my property. An old shed and a hay shelter they claimed were built without architectural approval. Mind you, these buildings had been on the ranch for over a decade, long before I bought it. Before half of the neighborhood even existed. They weren't trying to enforce rules anymore. They were looking for anything they could use to punish me. I took a deep breath and called my lawyer again. He reviewed the violation, laughed once, and said, "This isn't about code. It's about control. And they're getting desperate." We decided to file a formal cease and desist against the HOA, specifically Karen and any board member who had issued threats, sent misleading documents, or falsely claimed access to my land. He attached copies of the parcel records, photographic evidence, even a screenshot of the HOA's own bylaws showing their jurisdiction stops well before my ranch line. And just to make it airtight, we filed a copy of the cease and desist with the county clerk's office. I didn't expect a response right away, but what came next surprised even me. Karen showed up at my gate. No clipboard. No sunglasses. No smug expression. Just her and a plastic smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She rang the bell, then waited like a kid called to the principal's office. I answered through the speaker. "Can I help you?" She cleared her throat. "I just wanted to speak privately. I think we may have gotten off on the wrong foot." I held back a smirk. "You mean when you blocked federal investigators? Or when you filed fake violations against my land?" There was a pause. "I think this has escalated unnecessarily," she finally said. "We don't want trouble. We just want to keep the community peaceful." Peaceful. That word again. I said nothing. Just let the silence do the work. She eventually mumbled something about wanting to resolve things amicably, and walked away. No apology. No real explanation. Just retreat. But I knew it wasn't over. That wasn't an olive branch. It was damage control. And sure enough, the next HOA board meeting was packed. Neighbors who hadn't shown up in years were now filling every seat. People were asking questions about fines, about harassment, about who exactly approved certain enforcements. A few brave souls even brought up the crash, asking why the board had tried to interfere with first responders. Karen tried to dodge it all. Said it was a misunderstanding. That she was trying to protect residents. But the crowd didn't buy it. One man stood up, an older veteran who lived 2 streets over. He said loud and clear, "If the board is more worried about blocking help during emergencies than actually helping, then we've got a bigger problem than some sheds or signs." The room went quiet after that. Karen didn't have a response. The meeting ended without answers. But the shift was clear. The board wasn't untouchable anymore. The illusion of power was cracking. And back on my ranch, the air felt different. Not just because of the open skies or the distant hum of wind through the trees, but because for the first time, people weren't afraid to push back. About a week after that tense HOA meeting, I thought maybe things would calm down. The emails had stopped. The fines went quiet. No new violations showed up in my mailbox. For the first time in weeks, I was able to sit on my porch, breathe in the open air, and feel like maybe, just maybe, the storm had passed. But it hadn't. Because instead of a loud, obvious move, Karen decided to play quiet games. I noticed it first when one of my delivery trucks couldn't get in. The driver called me from the gate, saying the access code wasn't working. I walked down to the keypad myself and tried it. No power. The box had been shut off. I contacted the company that installed the gate system. They hadn't been called out. I checked the security logs. Someone had manually flipped the breaker near the HOA maintenance shed. That breaker controlled not just their lighting but also the power line that fed into my private entrance. Coincidence? I didn't think so. I restored the power and let it go for now. But I made a note of the exact time. Then I installed a trail cam near the gate, one of those motion-activated ones with night vision. And it didn't take long to catch something. 3 nights later, at exactly 2:37 a.m., the cam recorded someone walking up to the breaker box in a hoodie. The footage wasn't crystal clear, but the body language? The height? The way she moved? It was Karen. I sent the footage to my lawyer. He didn't even hesitate. "Let's report it. That's trespassing and intentional interference with private access." So we did. A formal police report was filed. And that footage? It went straight to the sheriff's office. Now here's where it gets interesting. The next day, I got a call from a deputy. He'd seen the footage. He knew the HOA had been sending me threats. He asked if I wanted to press charges. I said not yet. But I wanted a record. I wanted them to know I wasn't just going to sit back and watch this happen. Meanwhile, the pressure on the HOA was building from inside too. A few neighbors had started talking openly on community forums. People sharing their own encounters with Karen and the board. Stories about warnings for having the wrong fence paint, citations for kids playing too loud, and fines for planting the wrong species of flowers. It was clear the board's behavior wasn't new. I just happened to be the first person who didn't fold or keep it quiet. Then, out of nowhere, I got an invitation. Hand-delivered again, but this time more formal. The HOA had called a special closed meeting to discuss the recent disturbances involving ranch parcel boundaries and community safety. Funny thing was, they sent it only to me. No other homeowner. Just me. I laughed when I read it. It wasn't a meeting. It was a trap. But I went anyway. I showed up with my attorney. Karen was there, along with 2 other board members. They looked nervous. Papers on the table. A recorder in the corner. All very official. Karen started the meeting with a rehearsed speech. We're here today to find resolution. This back and forth isn't healthy for the community. We'd like to discuss a compromise. I didn't say a word. Just watched as she laid out her offer. If I agreed to remove the fencing near the trail and allow shared community access to the path again, they'd drop all fines, rescind all complaints, and even offer to recognize my contribution to the neighborhood. My attorney leaned forward and asked one question. Are you admitting the land isn't under your jurisdiction? Silence. That's when Karen folded her hands and looked away. We're not saying that. We're saying it's complicated. I stood up. Let me make this simple, I said. You lost. And the only reason I'm not suing is because I'm tired of wasting time on people who think power means making up rules as they go. We left without another word. But I could tell it wasn't over for them. Not yet. Because people like Karen don't quit when they're wrong. They dig in deeper. I thought refusing their so-called compromise would be the end of it. But the very next morning, I woke up to something new, something that crossed a whole different line. There were orange cones lined up across the back trail entrance to my property. Not just placed. Cemented. With fresh HOA signs staked into the dirt around them. They read, Emergency access closed until further notice, HOA authorized only. That trail was one of 2 routes used by emergency vehicles, ranch hands, and occasionally the FAA investigators who were still doing follow-ups. And now, it was sealed off, with no warning, no explanation, and no right. I called the fire marshal directly. I asked him if he'd been notified. His answer? We didn't close anything. If they've blocked access, it's a violation of safety code. That's not their jurisdiction. 10 minutes later, I had him and a local officer standing on the trail, looking at the cones. He took photos, shook his head, and told me, this isn't just a bad idea, it's illegal. You can't block off an access route to private land without a court order or coordination with emergency services. They pulled the cones out that same hour. But I wasn't done. I printed every single email, every violation, every map, and all the property records. I included the still frames from the trail cam footage and even a transcript of the fake closed-door meeting. Then I sent it all, certified, to the county's HOA regulatory division, along with a complaint outlining abuse of power, harassment, and obstruction of a federal site. The wheels moved slowly, but they moved. Within the week, Karen received her own letter. Not from me. Not from a lawyer. From the state. She was being formally investigated for violating HOA board ethics and potentially interfering with a federal agency's access to land. It was the kind of thing that made even someone like her sweat. I heard from a neighbor that she skipped the next meeting entirely. Funny how quiet things got after that. But just when I started thinking things were finally going to settle, a black SUV showed up again. This time, it parked on the HOA-maintained side road that curved near my eastern property line. I didn't recognize the man who stepped out. Suit, sunglasses, clipboard. He didn't approach the house. He didn't walk onto my land. He just stood there, took a few notes, snapped a couple pictures of the crash site from a distance, and left. It wasn't the FAA. It wasn't local. It wasn't HO. I checked every license plate camera on the trail afterward. The plate number traced back to a private consulting firm, one often used by insurance companies and corporate legal teams. Now why would an insurance firm be snooping around my ranch? Unless the HOA was trying to build a liability case. I sent the footage to my lawyer. He called me back that night with one sentence. They're trying to flip the narrative. According to him, the HOA might be preparing to claim that my property created the danger. That my land maintenance, or lack of it, somehow caused the crash or made the damage worse. It wouldn't hold up in court, but they didn't need it to. They just needed to muddy the waters. Scare me. Push for settlement. Or maybe discredit me before the investigation wrapped up. But what they didn't know, again, is that I had already submitted everything I needed to federal investigators. And not just about the plane. About the interference. About the harassment. About the power plays disguised as policy enforcement. So I did the one thing I knew would shut them down. I went public. I updated the press. A second article dropped, this time with receipts. Real documents. Real names. A breakdown of how the HOA tried to block rescue efforts, find the property owner, and mislead the neighborhood into thinking their power reached further than it did. The headline this time? HOA interferes with plane crash investigation. Ranch owner fights back with evidence and federal support. The HOA office didn't open for 3 days after that. No one from the board returned emails. Karen? Vanished. Not a single neighbor saw her for almost a week. But I knew something was coming. Something big. Because when you expose a bully who's built their empire on fake rules, they don't just walk away. They come back swinging. I didn't have to wait long for the next move. It came quietly, just like the SUV. This time in the form of a certified letter from a private law firm representing the HOA. The letter claimed that I had knowingly caused defamation and financial damage to the HOA board members by publishing misleading and harmful content in public forums and media. In simple terms, they were threatening to sue me, not because I'd done anything illegal, but because I had told the truth publicly. They called the articles slanderous. They said I had incited hostility in the community. They even accused me of creating division among residents and deliberately undermining the authority of the HOA. I brought the letter straight to my lawyer. He skimmed it, leaned back in his chair, and gave me a tired smile. They don't have a leg to stand on, he said. This is a scare tactic. Classic HOA maneuver when they're losing control. But I knew it wasn't just about scaring me. It was about reclaiming their image. I wasn't the only one who had noticed things shifting. The community had started paying attention. More and more neighbors were showing up at board meetings. People who'd never spoken up before were now standing and demanding answers. One woman shared how she'd been fined for a vegetable garden. Another man said he was threatened with a lien over a mailbox that was 2 inches too wide. And when they brought these up at the meetings, the board couldn't hide anymore. The old playbook of ignoring questions, deflecting blame, hiding behind rules, wasn't working. Karen still hadn't shown her face since the second article dropped. Rumor had it she was taking a break from board responsibilities, but everyone knew the truth. The heat was too much. The investigation hadn't gone away. And the more they tried to bury the truth, the more people started digging. Meanwhile, FAA officials returned to my property for one final review. They gave me an update, off the record of course. The crash had been caused by a mechanical failure, something that had nothing to do with land conditions or maintenance. No legal liability on my part. The case was almost closed. Before they left, one of the agents shook my hand and said, "We appreciate your cooperation. Not every landowner would have stayed this calm, given what you've dealt with." I just nodded, because I wasn't looking for praise. I was looking for closure. But Karen and her board weren't finished yet. 3 days later, the HOA held an emergency community vote. The agenda? Propose new rules for crisis protocol, media engagement, and property access procedures. Basically, a desperate attempt to rewrite the rules after the fact, to control how homeowners respond during emergencies, and to silence people who speak out. But this time, they underestimated how many people were watching. Dozens of residents showed up. And when Karen finally returned to the room, she didn't get a warm welcome. She walked in wearing her usual sunglasses, trying to act confident, but it was clear her grip was slipping. People stood up and asked why the HOA tried to restrict federal agents. Why they targeted one homeowner over a crash he didn't cause. Why they sent legal threats instead of apologies. Karen tried to answer, but her voice cracked. Then someone said it loud enough for the whole room to hear, "You didn't just cross a line, you tried to erase it." That was it. Several board members quietly pushed their chairs back and walked out. A motion was called to delay the vote. Then, a petition was passed around to recall the entire board. And just like that, everything began to shift, again. It wasn't revenge I was after. It wasn't about showing power. It was about truth. About standing your ground when you know you're right, even if every letter, sign, and threat tells you to back down. And as I stood at the back of that crowded meeting room, I realized something. This wasn't about a plane crash anymore. It never really was. It was almost surreal watching the same board that once stormed my gate now scrambling to hold onto their seats. The recall petition had spread fast. Within 48 hours, over 60% of the neighborhood had signed it. Names of people I barely knew. People who had kept quiet for years. But now, their silence had turned into signatures. One morning, I found a folded note taped to my fence gate. Handwritten. No name. Just 3 words, asterisk, "Thank you finally." That's when it hit me. This wasn't just about my fight anymore. It had turned into something bigger. Something people had been waiting for, hoping for, but were too afraid to start on their own. Karen's actions during the crash weren't a one-time thing. They were just the moment the mask came off. And now, the entire neighborhood had seen what lay underneath. Even still, the board didn't go quietly. Before the recall could be finalized, Karen and her remaining loyal members called for one final vote, something they called the Emergency Control Amendment. It was a desperate move dressed up in legal language. It would give the board power to take immediate control of any property they deemed a community risk in a declared emergency. No vote. No warning. Just complete access. They claimed it was to prevent future confusion and disruption, like what happened during the crash. But everyone knew the truth. It was a power grab. A last-ditch attempt to rewrite the rules while they still could. The night of the vote, the community center was packed. People stood shoulder to shoulder, spilling into the hallway. For once, it felt like the entire neighborhood was awake, alert. Karen stood up to speak, but every word out of her mouth landed like a brick. Cold. Rehearsed. Hollow. She said it was for safety. She said it was for order. She said, "We can't allow chaos to return." Then a woman in the back of the room raised her hand. Quietly, calmly, she said, "Was it chaos? Or just you losing control?" And that was it. No one clapped. No one booed. Just silence. Heavy, undeniable silence. The kind that tells you everything without a single word spoken. The amendment failed. By a landslide. 2 days later, 3 of the board members officially resigned. Karen tried to hold on a little longer, but her days were numbered. A final vote was scheduled for her removal. And as the deadline neared, I started seeing more and more changes around the community. People waved when they passed me on the road. Some even stopped by just to talk. Not about the crash. Not about the drama. Just normal things. The weather. Cattle prices. New fence posts. For the first time since I moved here, it actually felt like a neighborhood. And yet, I couldn't let my guard down. Because one morning, while checking cameras near the eastern boundary, I noticed something. A gap in the trees. A section of brush that had clearly been moved. Someone had tried to sneak onto my land, again. They didn't get far. The new sensor picked them up immediately. But they left footprints. Fresh ones. I followed them to the edge of the woods and found a trail of boot marks leading straight to the fence line. And there, hanging from a branch, was another sign. Handwritten in red ink. "We're not finished." No name. No HOA logo. Just a threat. Or a promise. I took the sign down, folded it carefully, and locked it away. Not because I was afraid, but because it reminded me that power, even when it looks broken, always tries to find a new shape. Karen may have been on her way out, but something told me this was bigger than just her. Some people build fences to keep trouble out. I built mine to keep the truth in, and to protect it from anyone who thinks they can twist it to suit their own version of order. Because if there's one thing I've learned out here, it's that when people who crave control lose it, they don't just walk away. They hide. They wait. And then they come back.